Hello, and welcome to Race Issues Part 2. I'm Pastor Frank E. Leggett III. In our last episode, my two guests, Elder Dan Jackson and Pastor Dwight Nelson, spoke candidly about race relations in the Adventist Church in the 21st century. But the question that I want to raise today is, how did we get here as a church? Have we always been racially divided? And more importantly, was it providence or coincidence that the Seventh-day Adventist Church was formed in May 1863 when America was in the throes of a civil war and was split, Northerners versus Southerners, over the issue of chattel slavery? Which side would the Adventist Church take? Would we stand for the rights of humankind and join ranks with the abolitionists and advocate for the emancipation of the slaves? Or would we turn a blind eye and accept the status quo? Those questions and others will be addressed in this episode of Race Issues Part 2. My guests, who will share their extensive and expansive knowledge of the subject matter, are Dr. Benjamin Baker, who's the Assistant Archivist for the General Conference, and Elder Alvin Kibble, who's the Vice President of the North American Division. Here is that interview. Dr. Baker, I want to start off with you. Whenever we take a careful look at civil rights movements, no matter when they take place, be it before, during, and after slavery in the 1800s and during the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, one will have to come to the conclusion that freedom in those two instances would not have been attainable had it not been for the persevering efforts of compassionate, caring, and freedom-loving white Americans like William Lloyd Garrison, Barton Stone, Lyman Beecher, Charles G. Finney, and others during the 19th century. And more recently, in the 1960s, during the early 60s, that is, something that I'm really starting to know and read and study and research, the Freedom Rise that took place, where African Americans, spearheaded by the Congress of Racial Equality in 1960 and following, went down into the Deep South on buses for the express purpose of crossing the color line. But not only were those buses filled with African Americans, but they were also filled with Caucasians who joined the movement. And so we see these phenomena take place. Understanding that, where did the leaders of the Adventist Church stand on the issue of race when compared with their white counterparts from the 1860s to the turn of the century around 1900?
You're asking the pioneers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church?
Of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. When we compare them with the individuals who helped bring about the end of slavery, like those individuals I mentioned, Lyman Beecher, Charles G. Finney, those ardent abolitionists, where did our pioneers stand on the issue when we compare them with those abolitionists of the 19th century?
Sure. Well, the Millerite movement effectively began when William Miller began preaching in 1831, preaching the soon advent of Jesus Christ. It effectively ended on the last disappointment, which was October 22, 1844. Our pioneers, the three founders of the church, James and Ellen White and Joseph Bates, were of course Millerites. From 1845 to 1863, May 2021, 1863, when the Seventh-day Adventist Church was officially incorporated and founded, the term Sabbatarian Adventist was used. And Sabbatarian Adventists were a loosely connected network of believers in the Midwest and Northeastern United States who believed in things like the seventh-day Sabbath, the non-immortality of the soul, the high priestly ministry of Jesus Christ. Now, our pioneers who were a part of the Millerite movement, James White, Joseph Bates, they were very strong abolitionists, and they were anti-slavery. In fact, it's said that the abolitionist movement was begun in Joshua V. Hymes's church in Philadelphia. Now, of course, Joshua V. Hymes was William Miller's main PR man, and I think that he was one of the main catalysts for making Millerism successful and known and broadcasting it. If Joshua Hymes was alive today, he'd probably be on Twitter and Facebook because he knew how to utilize media and spread the message. But Joseph Bates, as I said, was a strong abolitionist. He was a part of the Abolitionist Society. He was a very outspoken anti-slavery proponent. And when he accepted the soon coming of Jesus Christ, he desisted his abolitionist and anti-slavery agitation because he considered the second coming to be, quote, the fountainhead of all reforms. Okay. So in other words, when Jesus comes, he will end slavery. You know, he will get rid of tobacco. You know, whatever rights he was crusading for, Jesus' coming would address that. And so this is kind of a shift in the thinking where they thought this evil institution of chattel slavery is so heinous that only Jesus' second coming will end it. Now, when Jesus didn't come on October 22, 1844, our pioneers, in their writings, in their sermons, you saw a shift in their thinking, where now that they realized that Jesus was in the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary, and that they had to preach the gospel to the entire world, that maybe slavery could end before Jesus came, because they had to reach the black American slaves. And how could you reach them with the infrastructure of slavery in place? It was against the law in many states to teach slaves how to read. That's right. So they can't get the gospel this way. But they came upon the realization that everyone had to have the gospel. And as wartime approached, they became very strident and vocal and outspoken in the publications against slavery. In fact, John Andrews, John Loughborough, Uriah Smith identified the United States as the eschatological villain of Revelation 13, the lamb-like beast who speaks as dragon. They identified America as that dragon-like beast because of chattel slavery. They said, look, you can't get more dragonish, more beastly than this, than enforcing people to slavery. It was a lot of things, but it was religious bondage. They did not have religious liberty. They did not have religious freedom. The slaves did not. They could not take the seventh day off. And so they saw America as speaking as the dragon through slavery and secondarily through their treatment of Native Americans. And so the Seventh-day Adventist Church, so much of what we believe about the end times is based on who we believe America to be. And that was really come upon through the way that blacks were treated and by our early pioneers. So they were extremely outspoken against slavery. And I mean, I give them a scale of 1 to 10. I mean, I give them a 10. When you read the Adventist Review from 1850 to the end of slavery, 1865, there are endless articles against, condemning slavery.
Elder Kibble, do you think it was providential or coincidental that the Adventist Church was raised up during the most tumultuous period in the history of this country?
I see it nothing other than divine providence. God is amazing. And I have come to realize that God will use what he hates in order to accomplish what he loves.
Yeah.
God is he's never stymied by the machinations of men. That is why he can cause our stumbling blocks to become our stepping stones. You just can't find a God more amazing than our God. Mm. And he will use the events of history. It is no surprise to me that emancipation and the organization of the Seventh-day Adventist Church came hand in hand.
Right.
He gave us a message, albeit we were not a perfect people. But he gave us a message, and he entrusted that message in a very special way to Seventh-day Adventists. Not only did we have the pioneers that Dr. Baker spoke of, but John Byington, you can't leave him out. You can't leave out John Harvey Kellogg, who didn't just write about and talk about racism, but they were activists, and they practiced the acknowledgement of the of equality and of the brotherhood of mankind.
Right.
They actually practiced it. Ellen White in 1859 spent the night in the home of William and Eliza Hardy. Now you might not think of that as a big deal, but it was against the law in 1859 for a white person to stay in the home of a black person, and she ate at their table. This would not have been, acceptable. This was not normal, and she didn't do it in some kind of cowardly fashion. So we have an amazing history, and we have true giants, not just in their spiritual vision, but in their social values that were ingrained in the messages that they preached and in the lives that they lived.
Dr. Baker has already spoken to the question I was going to ask you also. He said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you grade, what grade would you give to the Adventist Church for how it handled slavery in the 19th century? I'm asking you the same question. Scale of 1 to 10.
God used people. He does not always have the same success with organizations, because organizations are made up of a variety of individuals. When Joseph Bates was burdened that no one was preaching the three angels' messages to the slave masters and the slaves in the South, he took it on himself. But even he realized how volatile the South was and did not want to go south by himself. So he went and got his friend, H.S. Gurney, who was a blacksmith. That'd be like my asking my friend who is the linebacker for the Dallas Cowboys or for the Washington Redskins or whoever to go with me, because he realized they could be lynched on the spot. And even Gurney realized that this was not going to be any sentimental journey. This was going to be a mission trip. And he said, hold up, brother, and let me think about this.
And they almost were assaulted.
And they were. But they agreed to make this venture because the gospel of the kingdom had to be preached. So it was not about this matter of not rocking the boat and staying in the safety zone. When Edson White began to write his mother, who at this time was in Australia, and how she got to Australia is a story all by itself. Mm-hmm. But when he began to write her about his burden, and she directed him to the writings that she had presented at the spring session of the General Conference, I believe it was 1890, March of 1890, he realized then that he was he was actually circumventing the law of the country. He got his friend Will Palmer to help him to build this riverboat.
I'm coming to that, Elder.
And so you're seeing there that in an effort to try to fulfill the missional responsibility that God had given, they were willing to break laws, break civil laws to do it.
Okay, let me ask you, let me piggyback on that and ask this. I'm hearing all of these magnanimous things that the pioneers did in support of slaves, free slaves, African Americans, who had been severely disadvantaged because of this horrific institution called slavery. And I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to know that. My picture is changing as we speak. But my question is, was this done by individual Seventh-day Adventists who had this particular hatred of this institution because they were great and noble men and women, or was this the official policy of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Did the church have a policy against slavery?
Now, that's where we need to go with this, because what got Ellen White to Australia was a sequence of events. Now, there were several issues, but the one that was the straw that broke the camel's back was in 1889 when Elder Charles Kinney was being ordained at the Kentucky-Tennessee camp meeting about 4 miles outside of Nashville. And Robert Meade Kilgore, who had fought in the Union Army and was a recent convert to the Adventist Church, had been assigned as leader of District Number 2. Now, District Number 2 was the entire South. Mm-hmm. And I understand he was a fantastic preacher. But following that camp meeting that summer, he had, in his report, written to the General Conference that things had not gone well at all because whites and blacks were commingling with one another on the campground. And beside that, Charles Kinney, long before there was a Martin Luther King Jr., had staged a protest because Kilgore did not want Kinney's family to sit in the audience with the rest of the people at his own ordination.
At his own ordination?
At his own ordination. And he felt, he certainly felt disenfranchised. And then in the fall of that year, Kilgore came to the Fall Council himself and said, we're going to need to set up some rules for the work in the South. Now, you're talking about the corporate responsibility of the church. After 1863 and the assassination of President Lincoln, you know what was happening in the South. The Jim Crow laws were coming back into effect. The war is over now, and it's back to things as normal. And they're putting these laws back into effect in order to marginalize and control these slaves. And Kilgore is thinking, well, we're going to need something like that within the church. Well, Ellen White was not at that particular Fall Council, but she heard about it. And she began to write some pamphlets on what the Lord had shown her about our duty to the colored people. And at the March meeting, the Spring Council, she came and she presented that report. Now, it's not in the history books, but that was when the brethren put their arms around the dear sister and said, we think the Lord is calling you to Australia. Now, it wasn't that alone, but that seemed to have been the galvanizing issue, and she went. She went. But it was from that standpoint that the church is now still trying to walk into the light of truth. You know, the Bible talks about truth being like a shining light that shines brighter and brighter. You know, I have to attest to that when individuals came into the three angels' messages and they accepted that, they didn't accept quite naturally the eternal and universal brotherhood of man. No more than when the writers of our Constitution wrote those prolific words and they were still slave owners themselves. And so that's where I see the church during those early years. By 1895, Ellen White still had not been able to influence and to bring about the change in the organizational structure. And you would have to recognize that this is a particular challenge when the civil laws were against this as well.
Okay. Dr. Baker, both of you have shared stories of these great men, moral men and women. Would it be a reach to say that there were some racists in the Adventist church, maybe even in the leadership of the church? Because our history shows that there was a separation. There were issues with worshiping together. Is that a reach, or is it possible that there were some in the midst in the church?
I think sure. There have always been a mixed multitude with God's people. I mean, I would say without a doubt. I think that we have everything in our church. But if you're asking, did the racist policies, or I would say the policies that reflected Jim Crow, were those because of racism? I can tell you what the original reason for them was. And that was initially when there were desegregated or unsegregated gatherings of blacks and whites, and an Adventist minister was in the South preaching to them and ministering to them. There was considerable friction, and there was often violence. Okay, they were often, you'll see this, there's a big theme in Ellen White's writings around the turn of the century. It's called the closing of the South. And she believed that because of racial tensions and things of a incendiary nature, that the possibility, the portal, the window of evangelism in the South for Seventh-day Adventists would close, literally, and we would not be able to do evangelistic forays into the South. Now, really, since slavery's in 1865, the institution of slavery, we were persona non grata in the South, because the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they were Northerners, they thought like Northerners, they were pro-union, and they were anti-slavery. So already, with that, forget about ideology, there was already a cultural difference. Okay, so many Southerners saw Northern Adventist evangelists coming to the South as, whatever, Yankee or carpetbagger coming here trying to impose their views on us. And so Elder Kibble mentioned R.M. Kilgore. I believe that initially he wanted to observe the segregation policies. Many times they were informal; they weren't always law. But the segregation, informal policies, to be successful in evangelism. Now that's giving him the benefit of the doubt. Of course, some of our ministers who went to the South could have been racist before, and what they encountered down there, jibed with what they already believed. But the way that it was presented was, we need to reach this vast field, District Number 2. And in fact, when you read it in early Adventist literature, it was often classed with Europe, Australia, Micronesia, Africa, and then the South would be right there. Because this is a vast, unentered missionary field, right? Initially, they said this field has to be reached. We have to preach the gospel to everyone, and we cannot do it if we practice desegregation, if we practice total integration. They'll kick us out. It'll be closed. We will immediately be vilified. And so, if this may sound strange, but I think for many who were down south, many Adventist evangelists, they had a good motive, and that turned out to be Ellen White's motive when she wrote statements that are still quoted today that seem to countenance and justify segregation. She was saying, do this, number one, so that we can reach blacks and whites with the gospel, and number two, so that we won't be killed. Her son was in danger of his life.
That's right.
In the South. So she's saying, I don't want you killed, literally. And so, of course, we still use those statements now. So,
One thing that I'd like to interject, there were laws on certain books that would suggest that for even a white person to assemble a group of black people, that they could be beaten with 39 lashes of a whip and fined an entire year's salary. That is what Edson White took on when he attempted to preach to the blacks. But because the laws of the sea were different than the laws of the land, he came up with a plan covertly to take them on board the Morning Star, to teach them and to disciple them, and then would drop them back off on the shore.
yeah.
In First Testimonies,
And it needs to be said, piggybacking on what Dr. Kibble said, they were eventually kicked out. They were run out of the South. Where Edson said there was an incident with one of his converts, N.W. Alvin, and he was shot and his wife was whipped by white vigilantes who were tired of the Adventists and the boat flouting the color line, and Edson left. Edson left the South. Now he came back later to start Southern Publishing and what became the Southern Conference in Nashville, but he left, and Ellen White feared that was the closing of the South. Now it ultimately wasn't, but they were effectively run out for what they were doing.
trying to spread the gospel. In first volume of the Testimonies, page 264, paragraph 1, Ellen White said, God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery. He has the destiny of the nation in his hands. He will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence. She also says this, and I quote, at the conference at Roosevelt, New York, August 3, 1861, when the brethren and sisters were assembled on the day set apart for humiliation, fasting, and prayer, the Spirit of the Lord rested upon us, and I was taken off in vision and shown the sin of slavery, which has so long been a curse to this nation. Elder Kibble, my question to you is, why was Ellen White able to so fearlessly voice her displeasure on the issue of slavery and the way whites were treating blacks, as she did with the Fugitive Slave Act, which was passed in 1850? And she counseled white Adventists, I believe the year is 1859, to ignore that law. Why was a woman able to stand up so boldly and defy the law?
I believe it could be no other reason than that she was called of God. Those are not just human instincts and womanly passion. She felt called of God, and she was determined to do whatever necessary in order to advance God's cause. She was truly anointed of God. When I revisit Martin King's speech down there at the mall in Washington, and he talks about, I may not get there with you. How could he stand up there and advance that message? How could he do it? And now we are now hearing, and I have to thank Dr. Baker for this, that last trilogy that he added on the end was not a part of his original message, but one of his guests on the DS said, Martin, tell him about the vision. And he goes off into this antiphonal chant about mine eyes have seen the glory. Something more than humanity is at work here. And I think we see this in the ministry of Ellen White. She was an anointed prophetess to the nation. And I believe that that's where her strength came from.
Amen. Dr. Baker, Ellen White was a stalwart champion for the rights, freedoms, and salvation of African Americans. And yet, there are some African Americans who are convinced that she was a racist. Why?
Like I said earlier, Pastor, her writings, and Elder Kibble said so much already. When Edson White and Will Palmer and the Southern Missionary Society went south down the Mississippi on the boat Morning Star, Edson began a correspondence with his mother in Australia. And he was sort of on the ground, as it were. He was a player in this whole drama in the South. And it was by no means the first, but it was one of the most significant. It was the first significant evangelistic forays in the Southland by a Seventh-day Adventist. Of course, there were others before, but I think because of Edson's stature as Ellen White's son, and the drama and the epicness of taking a boat down, of assembling a team and taking a boat down for purposes of mobility, because they anticipated what was going to happen in the Jim Crow South. They knew they were going to have to be mobile and move. They knew that they could take people onto the boat and teach them there, and that they wouldn't get ostracized and persecuted like they would on land. And so they anticipated all this. And so Edson began, but they still ran into trouble. There was extreme turbulence. And so Edson was writing his mother in Australia. And I believe that her motherly instincts were seriously kicking in, because Edson's wife, Emma, she contracted malaria, and others were getting sick. In fact, she had to spend a lot of time in Michigan and other places because they weren't used to the mosquitoes and the heat. And other members of the Southern Missionary Society were facing persecution. They were castigated in the newspapers for being integrationists and for carrying these, liberal northern views of race. And of course, there was the whole issue of, a black man's around a white woman, so sexuality is mixed in there. And Ellen White was receiving these reports from her son in Australia, and as a mother, she wanted to protect him and the Southern Missionary Society and everyone involved. But I think primarily she wanted the gospel to be preached, and she knew, as eventually happened, I think it was 1899, that they would eventually get kicked out of the South of a certain city, and they go from city to city, but that they would eventually get kicked out if they tried to observe what she originally said in 1889 and in 1891, where don't pay any attention to any color line. Because she said things like, would Jesus say to my black brother, you can't sit here? And so she said, there's no gospel of Christ in this. The gospel of Christ says we're all journeying to the same heaven. And black and white and the Asian man and everyone's name is written in the book of life next to each other. She said, God sees no color. Heaven sees no color. And so she was saying all this, but then when her son went down south and she saw the realities, and by the way, I think that it even got worse, right, as time went on, because she did predict race wars. She said, she said, I fear that, it's like W.E.B. Du Bois and Souls of Black Folks. She said, I fear the color line will always be an issue. I think it will always be an issue. And so this was getting worse. And so she saw race wars, and she said the South will close and all of this. But she wrote her son, and from the late 1890s, 1900s, where she wrote the 9th volume of the Testimonies, she changes her counsel. It changes for evangelism and for the safety of the Adventist workers down south. It changes. And when we're reading those today, our thought is, how could you capitulate on race and equality
so dramatically
for any reason? For any reason. That's our mindset now. How could you do it for any reason, even spreading the gospel? But she was a pragmatic, Matthew 24:14, this gospel must be preached. I want everyone to have the gospel. She would do what needed to be done temporarily to get it out. Now, once you know that, you can say whatever you want about her. You understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. I mean, once you know her motive, now then you can judge what you think about it. But she wanted to get the message out. And my goodness, that's what happened. Adventists in the South learned the gospel through the wrong segregation methods. Elder Kibble mentioned that God's purposes will not be stymied by any sin or evil that men do. And Ellen White knew it was evil, but she said temporarily until the Lord shows us a better way. We need to observe these laws just so that violence will not be perpetrated against us, and we will be cast out, and we can't spread the gospel to anyone.
The same the same element of misprism is often castigated upon our slave fathers and mothers. And individuals today, even some African Americans, feel, why did they tolerate it? Why did they allow this to happen? Why didn't they rise up and do something? And it's because they are not fully understanding the context and the backdrop in which all of this is taking place. If the slaves, and some of them did rise up, and with John Brown and others, but if they had as a people done that, then the same thing that happened to the Native American would have happened to the slave. And they would have created genocide. And so it took strength for them to bow their heads, shuffle their feet, and say, yes, massa. Yes, massa. Because it was a matter of timing. And I think that even there, that God was leading. when they saw their women whipped and raped and beaten, as we saw in 12 Years a Slave, and they didn't have something to say, that it was timing. And I think it was the strength of courage just to hold your tongue until God shows us a way.
Dr. Baker, what is the earliest recollection we have of African Americans joining the Adventist Church?
Elder Kibble mentioned it. 1858, 59, late 1850s, the William and Eliza Hardy family. They were located in Michigan. The name of the township or the county is slipping my mind, but they were pioneers in their own right, because the Hardy son, whose name was Eugene, he was the first black to graduate from a high school in Michigan. And the father, William Hardy, he was an elder, and he carried the work in that county. But the name of it's slipping me. But they were Sabbatarian Adventists, because this is the late 1850s, and we believe that they became Seventh-day Adventists when the church incorporated. There are other mentions in the old periodicals, the old reviews. There is a black preacher from Upper Canada, which back then Canada West and Upper Canada would be Ontario. I believe he was from Toronto, who embraced the Sabbath and other Adventist teachings. And he went back up to Canada, and this was 1855. And there were other early black Adventists, but it's just a matter of, and every once in a while you'll see them come up in the periodicals, the minutes. We don't know much about them, but they were the first.
Elder Kibble, aside from being asked to leave the auditorium, the tent, or whatever it was on his day of ordination, I'm referencing Elder C.M. Kinney, what is the significance, what is the impact that he had on the work that you can share with us?
Oh, Kenny was incredible.
Your face, as soon as I asked that, your face lit up.
You know, I wish I had known as a child.
Oh, man.
I wish I had known as a child about Finis Parker. Finis Parker was the person, he was the teenager that was the captain of the Morning Star. Edson White didn't know anything about riverboats. He didn't know anything about the Mississippi. But this teenage boy, this little teenage black boy, African-American boy, was the one who navigated the Morning Star. But no black person, young or old, could be captain of anything. So Finis was captain by night, and Edson was captain by day. Now, what would that have meant if my church had seen the value of sharing that history with me when I was a boy? The pride, the confidence that God can use even a child on such a dangerous mission.
Right.
For me, that's power. But
hold your thought, because you're going to jump in and say something. What
he said what I was going to say. When they were coming like near Memphis or some town along the Mississippi, he ducked down, and then a white person would come in and take the wheel. So because it was prohibited by law for him to captain a boat.
Finis Parker, continue.
Yeah, but restate your question again.
C.M. Kinney.
Oh,
what's the significance of Kinney, other than being kicked out of the sanctuary of the church, of the tent, on his own ordination? What contribution did he make to the church?
Look at this now. Kinney is orphaned right after the Civil War, and he catches a wagon train and ends up in Reno, Nevada. He runs into J.N. Loughborough. I don't know how long after he arrived there, but Loughborough is preaching a revival, and Kinney joins the church. Mm-hmm. Well, Kinney went to PUC.
Did he?
Back then, Hillsburg College.
And then from PUC, he pastored for a short time. I believe it was it may have been in Idaho or somewhere.
Wichita,
in the
Kansas.
Midwest.
Well, before he went to Wichita, he was somewhere further west. And then from there, he ended up in District Number 2. But Kenny mentored my grandfather. So, I mean, he was, you can only imagine, you're coming into this brand new denomination, and there are few that look like you, and of course fewer yet who are serving in some leadership ability. They didn't have at that time a training school. They didn't have a seminary. You were mentored into the ministry. Well, Kenny was the one that was doing that. And then along with him, Elder Sebastian and Elder Bradford and I believe there were some brothers. It seems like their name was Drew, but I could be wrong there. But there were many others like that. But Kenny was the one who was really setting the agenda and helping to get them up to speed.
Evangelist?
Yes.
Now he died in 55. Did you know him? Did you ever meet him?
I never got a chance to meet him. No, I didn't. I wish I had.
Wow.
1955, if you can imagine, he was born in
He was born in
1856, 57?
yeah. He was
He was almost 100
100 years, yeah.
when he died. And if you can imagine what Adventism was when he was born, and what it was in 55 when he died. I think when he died, the membership, the black membership was 25,000, because this was after the explosion of growth when after World War II, when regional conferences began.
No.
And so he saw it from its inception. He was the only person that the GC secretary. He held a correspondence with Dan Smith, who was the GC secretary then. And Charles Kinney was the absolute point man for the black work. I mean, they said, whatever you do, the black work is riding on it. We take your advice, whatever you say about it. And Charles Kinney, in fact, in 1889, he was working in the St. Louis area. And he had modest success. This is the thing about Kinney. Never spectacular. Never an evangelist where, that hundreds would attend. He would call putter and do Bible work from door to door. I believe that he laid the groundwork for Oakwood University in Huntsville, for sure, because he was in Huntsville and he was the one who suggested the property to the GC leaders. Oh yeah, definitely. But in St. Louis, he brought a couple of I think the term is good folk, good colored people, high class colored people. He won them to the faith, and he brought them to the only Seventh-day Adventist church in St. Louis at the time. This is 1889, and they were treated so reprehensibly.
There were some issues
By the white Adventists who were members of the congregation, that when Ellen White came, she said, I can't think of what happened without dread, because she heard about it, and she came later. And in fact, in her talk, Our Duty to the Colored People, in 1891, in front of GC leaders, she mentioned what happened in St. Louis, and she had a vision there in which she saw in a pen of fire where God wrote, "All ye are brethren." And God gave her a vision about race because of what happened in the St. Louis congregation. Now, because of St. Louis and because of what Elder Kibble mentioned about what happened during his ordination, Charles Kinney said, listen, for the furtherance and the prospering of the work, we may have to be separate. I can't bring recent young, neophyte converts, babies, into a church where because of their color, they'll be treated like dirt. He said, I can't do this. This will not work for evangelism.
He was the first to advance the idea.
How was
This
it
is
received?
Separate conferences,
This is
separate
before
churches.
1944. He is the first to advance that idea.
He was the first one.
How was it received?
But it needs to be said that it wasn't because he wanted it. It wasn't because it was for evangelism. I mean, my goodness, you're bringing new believers in. And I mean, it's just racism. They're just encountering flat out nasty racism. It was so nasty that Ellen White saw it. And she said, man, I can't think of this as years later. She said, I can't think of what happened without a feeling of dread.
And for many years, our pastors and our leaders had to shelter the new believers against the church.
Yeah.
Because if they had known how racist the church was, they would have left. So they wouldn't talk about it outside of a very small circle.
This is like G.E. Peters and W.H. Green. They couldn't eat in the GC cafeteria. But they wouldn't tell, the average member, their parishioners, they wouldn't tell them what happened because they wouldn't be able to handle that knowledge. So they kept all the discrimination that they endured daily working in the General Conference. They kept that to themselves.
Now, albeit a non-Adventist Caucasian could walk in from the street and eat in the General Conference cafeteria, but they are ordained ministers and leaders of the world church, and they gotta brown bag it. I'm telling you, these are some incredible and dedicated people. And they loved the church, and they loved this message, and they believed that when this gospel shall be preached for a witness, that Jesus was going to come.
Let me ask you this, Elder. 1896, landmark case, Plessy versus Ferguson, establishes racial segregation, racial division in this country. I've been of the opinion, and I'm willing to be educated, and I'm willing to change. I've been of the opinion that because we were the remnant church, which I believe, which we are, I have been of the opinion that we should not have followed society and embraced that same concept, brought it into the Adventist church, lock, stock, and barrel, the way that we did. I've been of that opinion, but I'm willing to change. Because I'm learning stuff, I'm hearing stuff here that I really didn't know before about the color line, about the emphasis that was placed on safety, and some changes that had to be made, some adjustments that had to be made. Did we as a church, when the United States government established that we are going to implement by law a system of separate and unequal, do you think we had to embrace that the way society embraced it? Or could we, because of our Christian values or moral values, could we have embraced another concept? Could we say, no, this is wrong, we're not going to embrace it, we're going to do what we feel Christ would have us to do? Teach me, educate me, talk to me.
When Paul talks about in Christ, there is no Jew nor Gentile. In Christ, there is no bond or free. In Christ, there is no male or female. It is speaking of a society that is unlike anything else other than the Trinity itself. There is no nationalism. There is no socialism. There is no gender difference in Christ. In Christ. So when when the church, no, I won't say in the church, I'll say when Paul, who said those august and majestic words, met with the cultural issues of his day about the role of women. He in some way bowed to a societal norm and said they shouldn't do any teaching and there shouldn't be any speaking. And so we find here in our humanity that we find a way to restrict ourselves. The gospel is very clear. It's very liberating. It's revolutionary if you want to know the truth. I remember in the early years of my ministry, there was a book that I purchased entitled Jesus the Revolutionary. And what a refreshing message that was. But then we re-enshackle ourselves. And in some ways, the church will find itself, if it's not careful, putting shackles back on that the Lord never intended. Because we're constantly wrestling against flesh and blood. You know, there's a humanity here that is uncertain and unprepared to embrace the liberty that God has given to us. And so instead of being advancing, we're holding and compromising our position. If the church had taken a stand, what may have happened at that time if we had taken that stand with that? Now, Ellen White prepared those pamphlets, but they were left on the floor of the Dimes Tabernacle when the meeting was over. It was a custodian that instructed Edson when his mother sent him there to find, you know, the manuscripts she had written, and told him they were out in the trash. In 1915, Ellen White died. What happened to our duty to the colored people? It was taken out of publication. It didn't come back into... When, in 1962, the General Conference president had never heard of those writings.
Never.
Never heard. He didn't even know that they existed. The writings of the prophet, they had been hijacked.
Our duty to the colored people, which ultimately becomes the Southern Work.
So
right?
it was taken out of circulation,
Okay.
and even the General Conference president didn't even know it existed.
So if we had as a church in 1896, drew a line in the sand and said, look, this is racist, we're not going to follow it, what would have happened to us as a church?
If I can say, in 1896, the church headquarters was in Battle Creek, Michigan, USA. They were not observing the color line there. To the Northern Adventists, the Northern Black and the Northern White Adventists, they were worshiping together. I mean, I have proof of this. In fact, when I mentioned the black Canadian preacher, he was in the meeting with Joseph Bates, and the black man got up and testified and said how he was going to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. Of course, Ellen White and other Millerites, they knew William Foy, the black man who had visions, and she actually attended, her whole family attended William Foy's lectures on his visions. She said, I went with my father. And she sat right next to William Foy's wife, Anne. And then after, she spoke with William Foy, right? Sure. She slept at the house of the Hardys. 1858, 1859. There was racial mixing. There was integration in the North. But Plessy versus Ferguson, the South, the Adventists in the South observed that for the most part. But in the North, that was not necessarily the case. And so I think that that's a distinction that needs to be drawn.
I don't think that distinction has ever been drawn, at least clearly not for me, because I thought it was just, you know, when we look at the history of race relations in the Adventist Church, we look at the institutions of the church. And if African Americans are accepted into those institutions, be it Union College, Southern, whatever they might be, very small numbers are allowed, and not being hired in state conferences and all these kinds of things. Those are the things that we hear most, I guess because they're the most salacious.
Right.
But you're suggesting and you are sharing with us something that the wider population of our church just may not be aware of.
Well, when you look at, and Elder Kibble can speak about this more knowledgeably than I can, when you look at the great migration of blacks to the North, the majority of blacks obviously were in the South, if we're talking 1865, the rest of the 19th century. The majority of the black population in America was in the South,
Sure.
right? And they began to migrate north, not in the 1920s, 30s en masse. Not much has been done as to the mindset that black Adventists grew up with being in the South, where segregation was a way of life. It wasn't even a question. We're talking 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. It wasn't even a question. And they brought that north, right? Now, I'm not saying that they were responsible for any of it, but there is a movement in Adventism. There's population shifting that I think needs to be factored in. And with the establishment of Oakwood University, now university, in 1896, we have an HBCU, an Adventist HBCU, the only one, is located in the South, in this climate where racial discrimination is a way of life. So I think that needs to be inserted into the...
And was a way of life well into the 60s.
Right.
So we're talking 50 years later. It's still a way of life. And the church corporately did not address this until the early 60s.
Why? Why not?
Because they were not confronted. It was a group of laymen that began to confront this. Now, I'm talking about after regional conferences are established.
And those were seen, for a while, those were seen as enough, as a solution.
Yeah, in other words, we have given you
Right.
something, and so, you should be satisfied. What is the problem now? What is the problem now? And I say again, truth comes to us in gradation. It's not just the preaching of the truth, but it is the acceptance of it, where we are willing to allow God's truth through the guidance of His Holy Spirit to bring about the transformational change in us.
And also, Doc, I think that it needs to be said at the General Conference in San Francisco in 1862. Excuse me, 1962. The issue that was the catalyst for this sort of grassroots movement, because there were really no leaders, church leaders involved. There were laid people.
There were
directly.
There were leaders who gave their approval,
right?
But it was driven by laymen.
Yes.
The leaders were fully aware, but again, having to navigate in these very difficult circumstances.
You're talking about 1962?
I'm talking about 1962.
What was the event?
The regional presidents were fully aware of the agenda and the initiatives that were being taken by
laymen?
Well, three prominent laymen, yes.
Frank Hale at the time was not working for the church.
Frank Hale, Miles Martin. And the contractor from Ohio. I'm sorry.
Can't think of the name. Miles Martin was a reporter in Cleveland. And so the issue that really raised up that group was a black Adventist not being admitted to a white Adventist academy.
Mount Vernon Academy. And Scott. He was the third one. It was Hale, right, Martin, and Scott.
And so the issue is blacks wanting to be a part, blacks wanting to be integrated, blacks wanting to go to school in a certain place and not being able to. So these are some of the same issues that brought about regional conferences.
You see, because the Adventist Church, because of its entrepreneurship, the Adventist Church had more companies and more organizations, albeit its small size, to practice racism upon. So while our message is liberating, in fact, our practice was oppressive. We had all of these colleges and universities. We had all of these hospitals. We had the printing press. All of these, three of them. We had the Review and Herald. We had Pacific Press, and then we had Southern Pub. All of those. We had the Worthington Foods. We had Loma Linda Foods. But for the most part, there were no blacks employed in those organizations. And it was all a matter of color. And I'm talking about well into the 60s.
So we are still wanting integration in 1962 in San Francisco. We're still wanting integration. And it's, to me, that is a consistent motif in our history. We want to be included.
Inclusion.
We want to be included. That's important. It's important to note.
But inclusion does not mean homogenization. Now let me unpackage that for you.
Please.
A lot of people think that the whole civil rights movement was about integration. It was not. It was about desegregation. Those are very distinctive concepts.
Right. It's about choice.
It is very, as a people, whether we are black or Asian or Hispanic or white, there's nothing wrong with our having something that is our own. But at the same time, it is a matter of not keeping someone out because of some ethnic, cultural, or language difference.
I can choose to worship in your church, but if I don't want to, that's fine. But I want the choice. I want the option. of being able to worship. That's the difference between integration and desegregation. That's desegregation. I have the option, I have the choice to worship with you. Integration is we're all worshiping together. But desegregation means I'm not prohibited from coming in and sitting next to you.
And you know, even in the scriptures, we see differentiation. God is not opposed to differentiation. He talks about that it is the same spirit but different administrations. We may have different styles of leadership. We may have different organizational structures. It doesn't mean that we're all the same. Unity is not uniformity. But there are those who prefer to lean toward, if you talk about unity, then we all have to dress alike, we all have to look alike. Well, unfortunately, I don't have that privilege because God already made me the way I am. Although there was a time when many black people really didn't like the way they were and preferred to be like the majority culture.
The dominant culture.
And that is something terribly wrong when you denigrate a person so much that they don't want to be who they are. So those are some of the things that have shaped, and Cornel West is right. Race still matters. Race still matters. But we now have been liberated by this wonderful gospel. And it's time for us to embrace that. But what does it mean when we embrace that? I don't want anyone to treat me like I'm not a black person. That's not a compliment. I don't even think of you as a black person. I am a black person.
I hadn't noticed, Elder. I'm glad you let me know, because I was.
But understand, when you tell me I don't even think of him as a black person, you're not doing something complimentary to me. But there are those, and some of them have been my friends, who have made that statement. They don't understand what that means. I want to be accepted, but I want to be accepted for who I am. So,
look, gentlemen, this has been incredibly rich. This has been enlightening. It's been educational. It's been all of the above. I can't thank you enough for your time, your sacrifice, your incredible knowledge on this subject matter. It is my prayer that this episode and the ones to follow will be spread far and wide. You know the saying, you don't know where you're going if you have no idea where you've come from. And a major purpose of this is we need to learn how to educate our people. We have a whole generation of young people who have come up. They're now attending our school. Some of them go to the university I graduated from, and they don't know our history. And our purpose and our goal is to educate our young folk so they can make some intelligent decisions and choices. I can't thank you enough. Thank you, both of you.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate your time. In closing, it is clear to me that attempting to evangelize America in a climate of racial hatred and animosity was no easy feat for this church. And notwithstanding that the Adventist church didn't always end up on the right side of the race issue and didn't always do the right thing as it relates to their African American constituents, I can say without equivocation that Ellen White never capitulated. She was a bold and fearless champion of African Americans in general and African American Seventh-day Adventists in particular. I hope this episode shed some light on the history of how the Adventist church handled the race issue that was so prevalent in this country at the inception of our church. I personally come away from this episode grateful for the men and women who championed the cause of my people during a very difficult time in this country. And although the slaves would ultimately be emancipated, they were yet a very oppressed people nevertheless. I'm truly thankful that there were Caucasian Seventh-day Adventists, namely Ellen White, her son, James Edson White, Joseph Bates, and others, who risked their lives and intentionally broke the color line to evangelize and educate African Americans so that this gospel of the kingdom could be heard, even amidst Jim Crow segregation. I will forever be indebted to them for their bravery and courage. In our next episode, entitled Separate but Equal, we continue to shine a spotlight on how the early Adventist church navigated the racial divide when racial hatred was a way of life, especially in the South. My guest will be my former president at Oakwood, Dr. Calvin Rock. We will look at the history of race relations in the Adventist church, starting with the year 1896 and the landmark case of Plessy versus Ferguson. We will take a careful look at how the black work advanced in the Adventist church and the tremendous challenges that our leaders faced in an attempt to grow the black work. Trust me, you do not want to miss Separate but Equal Part 1. Thank you for watching. Be blessed. I'll see you next time.